everyone. Welcome back to The Move, where we're vibing through the book 10 minutes at a time. I'm your host, Justin Koo, and in today's episode, we're talking about that one time in the Bible where God finishes creating literally everything, and then he decides to take a nap. If you're wondering, what in the world am I talking about? I'm talking about Genesis chapter 2, verses 2 to 3, and today my guest is none other than Pastor Harold. Pastor Harold, thank you so much for hanging out with me. I am excited for our conversation today. One kind of observation with a text that I wanted to make, and then I want to toss it to you, just see if this is just weird to think about it this way or not. But I was reading through Genesis 1 and 2, and I think about the gifts that God gives humanity in the book of Genesis, and I can think of two things. The first gift is the gift of sex, and the second gift is the gift of Sabbath. And so I'm wondering, does this mean that the Sabbath is supposed to is as good as sex, or at least it was intended to be? What do you think?
That's a great. Thanks for having me, Justin. This is going to be fun. Yeah, those are really good observations there and gifts that are in the text. You know, there is the gift of sex, the gift of Sabbath. I would add a third gift, and then that is the gift of work.
Oh, okay, yeah, all right.
That you see, a lot of times we miss that God is when He's finished creating the planet. I think some of us read into the text and think that the entire creation was this Edenic garden. And in reality, when you dig into the text, you discover that there's a difference between the Garden of Eden itself and the rest of the planet. Because there is this command to go and subdue the earth. There is this plan to go work the earth. So, you know, because sometimes then later on, you'll see this in chapter 3, people say, chapter 3 is God cursed Adam to work. No. It was going to be harder to work. But work was already given as something as a gift, because that's what this is all about. So work, rest, and sex are like these beautiful gifts that God gives us. So is the Sabbath as good as sex? To answer your question, man, I don't know. Yes, it can be. I think it can be. And also it can be as bad as sex.
Oh, okay.
Yeah, because I mean, let's face it, sex. I mean, we make sex is awesome, but it can be super bad also, right? Like it can be.
Oh, right? like how a knife can be used to murder or heal in the hands of a surgeon. It's depending in the context and how you use it. Is what you're saying?
Yes, I'm saying that. I think it's just one of those things that sometimes people just assume that it's all going to be like amazing immediately. There's some work.
Maybe not.
There's some work to be done, and it's going to be amazing. But your first time, chances are it won't be. But we're probably digressing into the subject. So my point was, it can be and it can't be, and the fact that the Sabbath, when it's filled with rules, regulations, and stipulations, and do's and don'ts, can be as bad as bad sex.
Interesting. Oh, okay. I wasn't thinking about it in that way. Okay, let me rewind a little bit, because you're reframing the creation narrative a little bit for me. I think you're right. When most people think that when the earth was initially created, everything was perfect. Like if you think about the globe, the entire globe, from top to bottom, left to right, everything in between, everything was perfect. And that has been a lingering question for me. It's like, well, then what's the point of work? What's the point of tending to the garden if everything's good? You're saying that, yes, the Garden of Eden was one place amongst the rest of the world, and there was kind of an area for us to subdue, hence the need for rest, the need for being able to take some time to recoup from this, which is kind of a weird thing, because when I think about God, you know, God has all of these different attributes and traits. He's omnipresent, right? He's omniscient, he's omnipotent. So when I think about God and the idea of rest, it doesn't quite make sense for me, because, you know, I think it's in Isaiah, it talks about how God never tires. He never is weary for any of these kinds of things. And yet here, the passage is making space for the idea that God himself is resting.
Yeah. I mean, it's interesting, because you do look at the text giving us various hints in which the Garden of Eden was the dwelling place of Adam and Eve. And there are some that even make this equivalency of that was the meeting place of God with Adam and Eve, kind of like his residence. They also tie that to the fact that after the fall, and you're going to be getting into this. So, spoiler alert: after the fall, Adam and Eve are expelled out of the garden, and then there is somebody placed at the entrance of the garden, an angel with lightsabers. It was placed
the fiery flaming sword
to forbid them to enter. So I think that the concept of perfection also is something that we should sometimes revise, is because perfection in our mindset, our Western mindset, has a lot to do with no flaws or no necessity of improvement, while necessarily that doesn't mean that the earth was perfect. It says that the earth was good. And God saw that it was done and it was good. And at the end of the whole passage there, chapter 1, he says, and he saw that it was good, like tov. So goodness and perfection, at least in the mindset of like pristine, don't touch it, don't need to do anything with it, doesn't really line itself up, which leads also to the idea of God necessarily not needing to take a nap because he's tired. As I've been looking at this, like it seems that the concept of rest, Shabbat, is akin to the concept of shalom. Shalom is not just the absence of war, but it is an overall idea of peace, right? That's what shalom is. That's what the greeting is. Shalom, shalom. So Shabbat, in the same way, is not the absence of toil and of labor, but it is sort of like the sense of Shabbat resting in completeness, in the tranquility of having accomplished that is something that is good. Because in fact, God has been quote unquote working for 6 days in the narrative. And there's this really beautiful pairing that goes on in the narrative where days 1, 2, and 3 are paired with 4, 5, and 6. So day 1 is forming, and then you tie it to day 4, which is, so day 1 forms light, and then on day 4 it's filled with the elements of light, the sun, the stars, the moon. Day 2 is forming the sky and the waters, and then day 5 it's filling those with the birds and the fishes. And the same thing happens on day 3, the earth, and day 6, the animals and man. But it doesn't stop there. That's where the 7th day comes in. So there's this chunk of time that God, a day that God sets up, and it is filled with his presence, filled with holiness, filled with rest. Sort of like this. It's good. After you've done something really creative, right? And you're so satisfied at the work that you've done that you're like, yeah, this is good.
It's changing the image in my mind, because the first image that I had was like God is a gardener, or God is maybe even like a bricklayer. I'm thinking that the way that God is quote unquote working in these first 6 days, it's hard work, it's difficult. But the way that you're describing it to me now, it's the picture is changing, and it's maybe more like an artist who's making a beautiful drawing. And that moment where they do the last addition to the painting or the drawing or whatever the case is, and they step back and
that's good.
And yes, that's probably hard work for the creative, like nowadays, post kind of the fall. But the sense that, everything that I wanted to do with this drawing is now complete, and this is kind of the sense that God himself is resting in this moment.
That's a beautiful image that I had not thought of. And like, as you've been saying it, like I'm thinking of everything that he is actually creating, just with the human body, right? Like imagine the incredible complexity of the human body, like the mind, the synapses, the neurological endings. And then how he's playing with the mud, right? And he's creating fingers and a mouth and eyes and every single thing that involves your body, right? And as he finishes that, and then he breathes into Adam, and Adam's like, I'm all by myself, right? And then he's like, anesthetic, bonk, and then gives like the difference of the potter that's creating, that's what he uses with Adam, and then with Eve it's the work of an architect. So he builds the woman, and my goodness, women are just like this beautiful complex being that is mirroring. So at the end of it all, the 7th day, it's like, yeah, this is good.
It reminds me of that artist Bob Ross.
Oh
the way that he just seems so joyful and pleased with what he's painting, what he's creating. And I figure, like, if there's an emotional capturing of how I'm now picturing with what you're saying, how God is creating the earth, it's like that. It's not like Gary Vaynerchuk, where he's like, you got to grind every single day, every single hour, hustle, 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 sleep when you're dead. Right. It's more like, man, you know what? I'm making something beautiful and meaningful, something that, you know, I'm very happy with. It's good. And then now I can rest because it's complete.
It's completed.
Hey, I want to focus on one part of the passage because I think that this is an important element, and it stands out to me in the narrative where it talks about how God does something to the seventh day. He not only rests, but he actually, I think the word is sanctifies it. That's not a word that we talk about a lot commonly. And I think for us and the community that you and I are part of as kind of Sabbath keepers, that we look at that word sanctified and in its relationship to the Sabbath as it's very important. It's set aside for a very particular purpose. And I'm wondering if you can kind of dive in a little bit into this idea of the seventh day being sanctified. It says in verse 3, God blesses the seventh day and sanctifies it because he had rested.
Yeah. I think that the resting, sanctification, and blessing all are intertwined. And I like the idea of like the sanctifying it. And I think that it goes back to the concept once again that we might have oversimplified with holiness or sanctifying something, in that we just, when we have the idea of like, well, what is a saint? You know, a saint is like Teresa of Calcutta, or, you know, somebody like that. Like they never sin, they never say a bad word. Like it's just like, oh, right. And versus the idea of sanctifying, or kadosh, meaning something that is set aside for a specific purpose, right? Something that has been made for a specific purpose and is being set aside for said purpose. So when he is sanctifying it, it's not like he is literally blessing and sanctifying a chunk of time. It's kind of like the idea of, this is Abraham Heschel, the great Jewish rabbi. Abraham Heschel has the idea of how he describes the Sabbath as a palace in time. And it's brilliant because if you think about it, in all cosmogonies of the world, in all cosmogonies of creation, right? The Greek cosmogony.
Sorry, what in the world does that word mean?
Oh, sorry. Cosmogony is basically story of origins, right? So a cosmogony is a story of origins. So every single people, cultural, has a story of origins, right? And Mesopotamians had a story of the origins or cosmogony, so the Egyptians and so did the Greeks. And in each one of those, after the gods create or do something that allows for the present physical material reality to exist, they establish a place in which they will meet or in which they will attend, kind of like a sacred mountain or a sacred grove or a sacred place, right? And
this would be like Mount Olympus, for like
the Greeks. That's where the seat of the gods is. Like it's Mount Olympus. And here is God, right? Jehovah God. We have to understand that Genesis is also polemic against those other cosmogonies, right? It's saying, that's the way that they think, but this is really how it happened type of deal, right? It's this polemic between both worldviews. And so God is establishing here this idea of not a space, but time. And the brilliance of it is this: human beings, we have tread upon every single square inch of space on this earth. We have conquered it. We have probably messed it up, destroyed it. There is no place on the face of this earth except for the Mariana Trench, which we still have had access to with our submarines, right? That we have not set our foot on, that we have not controlled, that we have not managed, that we have not conformed to whatever we want it to be. The one thing that we have not been able to control to this day, and I don't think we ever will, is time.
I love that because there's a hint in kind of a social equity, a social justice, if you will, in the idea of Sabbath. And it's made way more explicit in Exodus and in Deuteronomy when the commandments are actually iterated, that, you know, it's not just for you to rest, but it's for those that kind of serve under you, those who work alongside of you. And I love this idea because even if you're wealthy or if you're poor, like there's this equity that takes place on the Sabbath, where we all have access at the same time, or within this window of time, we have this kind of equal footing. We all have the permission, if not even the actual expressed commandment, to rest and to stop and to just be, not to just do, but to actually be. And I think that this is a beautiful reminder from the very beginning that yes, God is a God who creates. He's a God of productivity, and in that way we mirror him in what we do and what we create with our hands. But at the end of the day, we aren't human doers, we're human beings, and on the Sabbath we get to just be like we were originally created.
That's part of, like, the Sabbath is the great equalizer in many ways, aside from death. Sabbath is a great equalizer in that there's two extremes that you and I fall into if we ignore the Sabbath. There's the extreme of, and we see it very much so in the state of how the world functions currently. So you can fall into the trap of thinking that you own everything and that everybody owes you something because you're constantly working. You're constantly quoting Gary once again, gotta grind, because, like, you know, and then, like, there's a couple of expletives there that he says, and yes, he's very successful. It's great. I love it. But there is this trap that people fall, not Gary necessarily, but that people fall into, that thinking that they own the world and that the world owes them something because they've been able to achieve something, because you'll have time to sleep when you die. And then there's the other pitfall, the other extreme of the one that has to constantly work and never stops. And they're like in this hamster wheel, always running, always in the rat race, always trying to achieve. And you realize one day you wake up and life has flown you by and you're just a machine, and you never really got to rest. You really never got to be in the reality of resting and in the assurance of something that is completed. There's
a good nod. I'm gonna cut us off right there, because this is actually we're over time, and this is normally where we just end the episode and then we invite you to come and subscribe and to watch the next episode and all that kind of stuff. But since this is your first time on the move, I actually wanted to invite you to share a little bit about who you are. Who is Pastor Harold? I know, off cameras, you and I were talking a little bit about some of the things going on, like Mando and Spider-Man and Batman. Like, I know that you're an uber nerd. Maybe that's not how you want to present yourself to this audience. I think it's clear that, like, you're a nerd and you also are into theology. That makes you a theology nerd. I don't know, like, how do you self-describe? Like, what is the way that you want to introduce yourself to those who are going to be joining us for this series?
Oh, man. Yeah. There's just one thought as I add to that comes to my mind about the assurance of resting. I guess, like, you can choose to live in the constant anxiety of needing to achieve, or you can live in the assurance of something that has been already done and is finished. And that translates all the way to that translates to the gospel and to how we approach the Sabbath from a Hebrews chapter 4 extent. Like, it's beautiful. The Sabbath just puts us in that perspective. It liberates us from those two extremes of the anxiety of wanting and needing and doing versus chill, rest. I got this. I assured it and I finished it. And I've assured it to you, so you can totally rest in it.
I love it. So what I'm hearing you say is that you do identify and want people to know you as a theology nerd.
No, I don't know if I'm a theology nerd. So I love the text. I love the Bible. Definitely my greatest joy is telling people about the gospel and telling them about this beautiful freedom reality that we've been given, the reality of, like, new, like, God has created something new in Christ and we get to live in it. So I love the text. I love sports, soccer mainly. It's a depressing time for Barcelona fans. So in our depression, we unite. I like good movies. I like good movies that tell great stories. Star Wars, I love the story that The Mandalorian tells, right? And how it's been rescued from what some argue are just terrible episodes, whatever,
Jar Jar Binks.
Oh, stop. That's depressing.
It is.
I love good stories. So, the MCU, Star Wars overall, those are stories that in many ways are mirroring the great story. And I think that's why I find myself just gravitating towards those really beautiful stories and how they're told, and understanding that those are just different versions of the best story that we've ever heard, and that's in Scripture. So yeah, you could say a theology nerd, but I don't know. I just like the text. I like the Bible. I don't know if I'm a
maybe
nerd.
what you're saying. Maybe what you're saying is that you're a story nerd, and that's why I'm so excited for you to be here, because we get to dive into all kinds of stories, and whether that's only the story of Scripture, or we get to bring in your life story, or bring in stories from kind of contemporary media, we're going to be able to do all of that. So, guys, if you haven't already, go and check out Pastor Harold and all the different stuff that he has. We'll be linking it in the show notes if you want to follow him on Instagram or check out his church. There's a whole world online that you can follow him on. But if not, we'll see you guys in our next episode. Peace.